Je veux pour la deuxième fois remercier Patrick pour son invitation, pour son réception chaleureuse. Nous avons passé des temps bien intéressants à Nantes et aussi ici à Paris. Et c'est pour moi un honneur de remercier vous pour la possibilité de faire ces conférences. Merci beaucoup. Mais alors, je vais présenter la conférence en anglais, s'il vous plaît. C'est pour moi un peu plus confortable. Those of you who came to the first lecture will have been introduced to the concept that drives this set of lectures, and this is the concept of the Great State. Those of you who were here last week may have noticed that I did not ever define this concept. I simply construed it historically from the languages in which this concept appears. A concept which, as I said last time, is not attested well in any sort of theoretical understanding of what an Asian state is. And I also somewhat dodged the question of whether the Great State is simply an Asian way of saying empire. And I do so because I want us to not jump to a theoretical conclusion based on European experience, but to think, what is the Asian experience of constructing and extending an empire? If there are 5 attributes I can give you for this concept, it would be that a great state is territorially large. It is built through a process of expansion over people who do not recognize its ruler as their natural ruler. It is organized by incorporating rather than by sub-infudating or investing local leaders who are able to maintain their autonomy. It is structured in a hierarchy of groups depending on ethnic, loosely described ethnic identity. And finally, it's constructed ideologically through a theology of universalism and an activist theology of universalism. And to be slightly more concrete, if heaven has appointed someone to be a ruler, voila. If heaven has appointed someone to be a ruler, then theoretically that ruler has the right to rule the entire world.
A few minutes.
Okay, I will continue speaking from here. So, I'm a specialist in the Ming Dynasty, 1368 to 1644. And it's always bothered me when we talk about the Ming Empire. And again, starting from a European perspective, is the Ming, properly speaking, an empire? We fudge this in the Anglo-American academic world by talking about Imperial China, which is a China ruled by an emperor. But is Imperial China the same as we would say Imperial Britain or Imperial France? Obviously not. There are 2 different senses of the word that collide and interrupt each other. So my way of trying to deal with this problem of is the Ming an empire or not, is the language appropriate, is to think about, well, first of all, when did Europeans think it was an empire? And then when did I think it was or wasn't? I'm going to recapitulate slightly from my lecture last week. The word empire is not used for China until roughly the 1650s. Before the 1650s, Europeans called China a kingdom. And it's only in the 1650s that the word kingdom begins to slide back and the word empire begins to come forward. It appears first, or the first instance I've found of a reference to Ming China as an empire is 1642. So it's during the Ming that the concept of empire begins to emerge in European language to describe China. But it's not really till the end of the 1650s that the concept is secure. And after the 1650s, everybody talks about the Chinese Empire. So let me approach this another way from my own experience as a student of China. When I was in graduate school, I ran into a problem of bibliographic citation. How to cite certain texts of the Ming Code, some editions of which called the Ming the Great Ming, and other editions of which did not. This came up in particular with the dynastic law code. Should I call it the Ming Lu, the Ming Code, or should I call it the Da Ming Lu, the Great Ming Code? The copy I worked with at the time was the great edition produced at the end of the Qing dynasty by the great Qing legal authority Shen Jiabun, and he called it the Ming Lu. So I thought, okay, if Shen's calling it the Ming Lu, then so am I. It was only later when I finally got my hands on a Ming copy of the code that I saw that the title was Da Ming Lu. Now this could be simply a sort of trick of language, but I realized it was consistent, so that the code under the Ming is always Da Ming, and then when it's referred to by a Qing person, it loses its Da, it loses its greatness, it just becomes the Ming Code. Merci. So that what seemed to be going on is that a reigning state is able to claim for itself this status of Da, this status of great. And other states cannot claim that as well. Now, if I had been paying attention, I would have known that Matteo Ricci had already told me this. This is the Jesuit missionary who was in Beijing at the turn of the 17th century. And in his memoirs, he writes he describes in his introduction what China is. And I will quote him. From the year 1368 has reigned the family Zhu, calling itself Ming, which means brightness. And at present, that family prefixes the name with the syllable Da, and so is called Da Ming, that is to say, great brilliance. He also informs us that this is why Europeans tend to put the word great in front of China. Marco Polo called it Great Cathay. The Spanish call it Gran China. Now, where Matteo Ricci goes wrong is in his explanation. He says China is so big it has to be called Da, which, from my point of view, has nothing to do with it. If we go and look at the enthronement edict of the very first Ming emperor issued on the 23rd of January, 1368, Zhu Yuanzhang, his name, announces that the name of the new dynasty will be Da Ming, the Great Ming. The term is not used consistently during his reign. It appears on some state publications, not on others, but it is employed consistently in diplomatic correspondence. So most of Zhu's letters to Mongol leaders begin by referring to the Ming as the Great Ming. For example, the Emperor of the Great Ming notes and inquires, or the Emperor of the Great Ming notes and instructs. This is how his letters to the Mongols all begin. So it's important for him. It's part of the claim that he is making about his own state. Now, I've already let you in on the backstory, which is that the Ming took the term from the practices of its predecessor, the Yuan, which called itself the Great Yuan. And that the Yuan, in turn, the Mongol dynasty, was following Mongol usage, distinguishing the state, the ulus, from the great state, the ik ulus. Of course, conceptual content does not always follow the migration of terminology. It's possible to argue, as I tended to do when I started thinking about this problem, that Zhu Yuanzhang was not content to rule anything less than his predecessor. And if his predecessor had been called the Great Yuan, then he would call his state the Great Ming. But there is more to the idea of the Ming being a great state than being so by default. It is essential to realize that Zhu's political imagination, first of all, was shaped entirely by the experience of growing up under the Mongol great state as a subject of the Great Khan. He would hearken back to pre-Yuan days when China was uninfected by Mongol practices. The language is sometimes that virulent. But his model of a political authority really remains Mongol. It told him what a ruler was. It told him what a state was. It told him what a ruler should claim in order to appear legitimate in the eyes of other rulers. Now, we could think of the Ming state then not as just a successor to the Yuan great state, but really as a breakaway polity. The Yuan great state continued to exist after 1368. It was just very much smaller. But Zhu understood this. So when he addresses the Yuan, the Mongol leaders after 1368, he addresses them in terms of the Yuan great state. So there is a great Yuan and a great Ming, and they treat each other accordingly. So what I want to argue is that the Ming continuation of the great state tradition was not merely vestigial, a holdover for what the Mongols do. There is in early Ming ideology a sense of continuing what the Mongols did. Zhu Yuanzhang repeatedly declares, 天下一统, all under heaven has been brought under one authority. In his political practice, though, he didn't adopt a more aggressive stance of vowing to force the entire world to submit to his rule, which is something that Genghis Khan certainly was prepared to do. He did dispatch armies of conquest down into the southwest in Yunnan. I'm going to return to that point towards the end of the lecture. He wanted to impose his sovereignty there, but he didn't launch a major offensive against the Mongols. They were his natural rival, and while he was consolidating his own great state, he was not going to interfere with theirs. So, to rulers throughout the maritime world, however, he wanted them to realize that the Yuan great state was finished and that the Ming great state had taken its place. He expected rulers from the maritime world to send him tribute. Now, we immediately read this as the reinstallation of the tribute system, a traditional way in which lesser state rulers dealt with the Emperor of China by submitting tribute to him. But I think there is more of the great state ideology that is at work here, and I need to do more work on this to identify this. Zhu Yuanzhang is quite anxious on this score. The first year or two, nobody shows up. And he needs their presence to give legitimacy to his regime. But in practice, he reputed the idea of trying to go out and conquer everything that his armies could reach. He was concerned with the reorganizing state and society largely within pre-Yuan boundaries. As soon as his son, Zhu Di, seized the throne from his nephew in 1402 and had himself enthroned as the Yongle emperor, however, this holding pattern changes. And the argument I want to make today is that the Ming re-engages as a great state. And it's under this man, Emperor Yongle. To get at this story, and there's a caricature of his father, Emperor Hongwu, whose founding of the great state of the Ming I've just referred to. Now, to tell this story, I'm going to refer to the now very famous voyages of Zheng He into the Indian Ocean. This, I think, is where we see the great state in action. In 1911, an English engineer working in Gala in southwestern Sri Lanka, he worked there for the colonial government's public works department, noticed a slab of stone laid over a culvert by a road that bore an inscription. He had the stone lifted and removed it to a place where it could be examined more closely. The stone, which I'm calling the Gala Stele, bore not one inscription but three: Chinese, Tamil, and Persian written in Arabic characters. These took some time to decipher and were not fully published until 1933. This stone is well known, but I'm going to suggest well known really to scholars of 40 or 50 years ago. It's mentioned in the tales of Zheng He, but it hasn't been closely examined for some time, and I want to go back to the inscriptions. The clearest and easiest inscription to read is the Chinese inscription. It's dated 15th February, 1409. The text, yes, and this is a summary of the travels of Zheng He, and this story has to do with the third voyage, which takes him to Sri Lanka, and I've given you a map here to show you where Gala is down on the southwestern corner. Here's a rubbing that was made of the text. The Chinese is on the right, Tamil is upper left, and then the Persian inscription is lower left. As I said, the clearest is the Chinese, and here I'll give it to you in its a recent, 20th century transcription. The text is from Emperor Yongle, and it's addressed not to any particular leader, it's addressed to the Buddha. Of late, the emperor tells the Buddha, we have dispatched missions to announce our mandate to foreign nations. And by 1409, 2 voyages had already gone and returned. On their voyages over the ocean, they have been favored with the blessing of your beneficent protection, escaping disaster and misfortune, and journeying safely to and fro. 2 senior eunuchs of the imperial household, Zheng He and Wang Qinghong, were about to leave for Ceylon at this point, and this is a text that they are to take with them, and he names them in the first line of the inscription. The prayer imagines the future moment at which they will reach the Buddhist mountain monastery in Ceylon. I'm going to flip between Ceylon and Sri Lanka in this talk. They will reach the Buddhist mountain monastery where they will present their offerings to the Buddha, quote, in order to manifest the high honor of the Lord Buddha, may your light shine upon the donors. The second half of the inscription is an itemized list of the alms that Zheng He will present at this monastery. 1,000 mace of gold, equivalent to roughly 100 ounces of gold, or I should be able to do the conversion into 30 kilograms of gold, perhaps. 5,000 mace of silver, 50 rolls of embroidered silk, 50 rolls of silk taffeta, 4 pairs of jeweled banners, 2 pairs of the same in red, 5 antique brass incense burners, 5 pairs of brass flower vases with stands, 5 yellow brass lamps for burning oil, 6 pairs of golden lotus flowers, 2,500 catties of scented oil for the lamps, and 10 pairs of wax candles and 10 sticks of incense. So all of the gifts are itemized very specifically there. So to the left of this inscription, we get the Tamil inscription. I don't read Tamil. This is a transliteration of that inscription. The first Tamil scholar to decipher it, S. Paranavitana, observed in 1933 that the language of the Tamil text can hardly be called grammatical and that it contains words attested in no other text, suggesting perhaps that it was written by somebody who knew Tamil but was not highly literate. It's again a prayer, but it's not the prayer that you just heard about to the Buddha. This is a prayer to a deity referred to as Tenavarai Nayanar. It's a name that appears to transliterate a Sanskrit term meaning the city of God. Although the Tamil rendering is slightly confusing, and it really is the city of God is what Tenavarai Nayanar actually says. It seems to refer, Tenavarai was a cultic center devoted to Vishnu in Sri Lanka, and it seems to be, therefore, a prayer addressed to Vishnu. And the Portuguese attest that this seems to be so because they found it in this Vishnu site. What they said, and they refer to stone pillars, that is, to several such texts, not just one, that they say, and I'm quoting from a Portuguese 17th century Portuguese account, the kings of China ordered these stone pillars to be set up there with the letters of that nation as a token, it seems, of their devotion to those idols. Well, I don't think it's a token of Yongle's devotion to Vishnu, but we're going to get to why he might have wanted this inscription made in a few minutes. It also includes the list of gifts, and they are identical to the list of gifts given to the Buddha. In his text to Tenavarai Nayanar, Yongle says that Yongle calls himself the supreme overlord of kings, full-orbed moon in greatness, in splendor. And then he goes on to address Vishnu as the sacred lord of the kingdom of Lanka. He declares, quote, all living beings who exist in this world are protected in happiness by this Lord's compassion, and his divine grace removes all obstacles to happiness. The fact that he has to repeat the same concept in a single sentence means that he really has no idea what Vishnu does or what he's praised for. It's a kind of short, generic statement saying, you are an important deity, you make people happy, and I'm making you some offerings. Now, the fact that the presents being given are exactly the same as the presents being given to the Buddha raises a question for me, which I cannot answer. Did Zheng He take a complete set, and as we're going to come to the Persian in a minute, did he take 3 sets of identical presents to present 1 set in a Buddhist monastery, 1 set in a Vishnu temple, and 1 set in a Muslim mosque? I doubt it. I think he brought 1 set of gifts, but I can't, the question then becomes, what are these texts? Are these sort of intersubstitutable devotional statements that each of the 3 communities can read? Is it a case in which one text will trump the other 2, depending on where the stele ends up? I have no answers for this yet. I'm undecided, but I'm curious about this problem. Now, measure words can be a good telltale sign of the process by which texts are translated into each other. So I'm just going to, I'll come back to the Persian text in a minute. I've put the 3 texts up here, and I've isolated a couple of measure words which interest me. Starting with the red ones. On the Chinese text, I've circled the word chen. A chen is 1/10 of a tael. I translated it as mace. That's the standard translation for chen. And it weighs about 3 3/4 grams, 1 chen. The Tamil units are kalankus, which weigh just slightly over 5 grams. What is striking here is not that the units are not equivalent. They're sort of close. They're not equivalent. It's that an effort has been made to preserve the amounts, the 1,000 in gold, the 5,000 in silver, and then simply to substitute whatever the appropriate Tamil weight might be. So the value of 1,000 mace of gold is not transformed into what that value would be in kalankus. The terms simply sit there side by side. So what I think this is doing is saying that this is the presentation of gifts is formally as it should be, and the actual these terms have been dropped in to make the text feel familiar to a Tamil audience, a Tamil reading audience. It's not actually a text saying how much Vishnu is going to receive. It's a text for Tamils to read and find familiar. There's another term here that gets used, and that is jin, which I've circled in blue in the Chinese text. A jin is traditionally translated as kati. This is a Malay word. A jin is, I can't tell you off the top of my head, something over a pound. I don't have that in front of me, but it's a standard weight measure. The curious thing is that the Tamil text uses kati. The Tamil text uses the Malay word. Now, is this because the person writing the text didn't know how Tamils measured things by volume, and therefore was simply picking up the Malay word? I think likelier it's that the Malay word was already in use in Sri Lanka, and we're seeing the effects of trade extending all the way from China through Southeast Asia into the Indian Ocean, because there is this single, and it's not a weight measure. Originally, it's a volume measure, a liquid volume measure. So the word kati, which Europeans would pick up as the correct translation for jinn, is already being used by the Tamils. And it's probably the Portuguese arrival in South Asia that gives them this translation that they pick up. All right, I'm also going to just briefly refer to the Persian text, which is written in Arabic script. Very little of that text is left. It's very badly worn. But we can pick up one of these measure words, and it's going back to chen, to mace, the measure for gold and silver. And in the Persian text, it's called a miskal. This is a unit of weight that was widely used in the Muslim world. And under Ghazan Khan, it weighed 4 1/3 grams. So it's a little smaller than a kalanku, but it's larger than a jinn. So again, we have the same problem. Was the Persian translator offering Allah an extra $0.50 on the mace for the gifts that he was going to get? Again, I don't think so. The translator was trying to find a roughly equivalent unit that would indigenize the text into local explanations. This then makes me, again, wonder what these texts are doing. Will one text, in a sense, rise and the other two texts fall once it's put in a location? But I'm going to have to think more about this in order to try and sort this out. I suspect it is. It's sort of three versions, and you present the version that you think the local audience is going to accept, and you largely allow the other two versions to disappear. Well, beyond the differences in language, of course, are the differences in theology. The Gale Stele asserts the Yongle Emperor's authority to offer pious donations to all three deities. The followers of those three deities did not consider these deities intersubstitutable. Now, the Buddhist dedication is the fullest text. It's, in a sense, the authoritative version on the stone, which makes sense. Yongle was an active patron of Buddhism in China, and there was a long, somewhat attenuated history that connected Buddhist monks in China and Buddhist monks in Sri Lanka, going back to the Tang dynasty. So this seemed to be the best foot to put forward. Sri Lanka was remembered in China as a holy Buddhist realm, and Chinese tended to subscribe to the idea that that's where the Buddha died, and in fact that he left his body in a monastery in Sri Lanka. So it made sense that the Buddhist text would be the one that would, in a sense, lead the diplomatic contact. But the problem was that Sri Lanka by 1409 was no longer a particularly Buddhist country. And so it's difficult to resolve this, and perhaps including the Tamil and Persian text was a way of hedging bets in case Buddhism was not going to be the winning card. Now, the language of the stele is religious. All texts are addressed to a religious deity. They're not addressed to any political leader, but the object is clearly a political object. Its practical purpose was to gain the confidence of Tamil and Persian trading communities in Sri Lanka. And its political intent, which is expressed by the pair of five-clawed dragons that you see there. I've included this photograph just to give you a sense of scale. There are two dragons that are entwined and facing each other at the top. So that signals the political intent of this document. These are five-toed dragons. They are the symbol of the Chinese emperor, and it announces that this stone is very much a political text. It was designed to overawe the ruler of Gala with the power of the Ming state, which I would argue is the power of the Ming Great State. No previous, I think I can say this, no previous emperor of China had ever sent a kind of a huge, heavy, expensive dedicatory object centered on himself to a distant foreign country before. And I'm just alerting you that by the end of this talk, I'm going to be arguing that all of this is evidence not of the Chinese state. It's evidence of a great state, very much in the Mongol style. Now, Professor Paranavitana, in his study in 1933, attributes the trilinguality of the stone to what he calls the eclecticism in religious matters characteristic of the Chinese race. But I tend to see it not as a matter of eclecticism. It's not simply cultural accommodation that's going on. It's intentional intervention. The right of the emperor to intervene in the religious affairs of all three communities, for which I think Genghis Khan is the better model than a Chinese emperor. Okay, now this document rests in the wake of, or sits in the middle of one of several violent incidents in which the Zheng He voyages were involved. The first, Zheng He does not go to Sri Lanka on his first voyage, but he does go on his second voyage in 1405 to 1407. By all reports, it is not a peaceful encounter. It ends with Zheng He. Zheng He apparently sought to pay homage to a Buddhist relic, a tooth of the Buddha that was kept there. But at the end of the encounter, he seized the relic and took it back to China. Something went on, and we don't really know what, but it was not a happy encounter. So he included the island on the itinerary of his third voyage from 1409 to 1411. And this elaborate stele may be part of some kind of a peace offering, a diplomatic initiative to rebuild bridges that might have been burned by the first visit. For a Chinese account of what happened at Gala, we have Fei Xin, a soldier who was attached to this expedition for the first time and then attended all of the Zheng He's other expeditions, and in mid-15th century writes an account of his experiences. And the soldier opens his section on Ceylon, he calls it Xilan, with descriptions of several local landmarks, including the Buddhist monastery where this stele was probably intended to be set. He then reports that Zheng He and his entourage presented the local ruler, referred to as Alagakonara, called Vijayabahu in Sinhalese sources. Zheng He presented the local ruler with instructions from the Yongle Emperor, along with lavish gifts to be distributed to the Buddhist temple. So from Fei Xin's point of view, the gifts were not being presented to a temple. They were presented to the local ruler, and that he was then in the position to present them onto the Buddhist monastery. And to go on with he said, they also set up a stone to honor the peaceful government of the country as it accorded with the imperial plan. So from Fei's point of view, this text was attesting to the good order of Sri Lanka under the kind of larger suzerainty of the Yongle Emperor. So having set the stage, Fei then tells us the story of the seizure of the local ruler as a hostage. Fei declares that the local ruler was stubbornly ungrateful, which is presumably a holdover from the previous visit, and it's a standard way among Chinese in this period to regret that non-Chinese don't appreciate it when Chinese show them favors. He alleges that the local ruler plotted to harm the imperial fleet, that this news leaked out, and that Zheng He organized a counterstrike. He launched his soldiers under cover of night against the palace. He seized the local ruler, and then he carried him off back to China for punishment by the Yongle Emperor for not serving the overlord appropriately. The Ceylonese guards were caught completely by surprise, so it was a quick and effective move. However, and I haven't yet thought how to incorporate this issue, in the court records over the next couple of decades, references pop up to men who died in this battle, Chinese officers who died, and their sons or grandsons are being given preference because their fathers or grandfathers died in this little war in Sri Lanka. I'm collecting those references, but it seemed that the Chinese side took casualties. Fei Xin doesn't report any of this. So it was a bloody battle. They seize the ruler, they take him back, and now Fei finishes his story by saying that they took him back, he expressed contrition, the emperor said it was inappropriate for Zheng He to have seized him at all, and then sent him back to Sri Lanka with full honors. Now we do know that he was sent back to Sri Lanka, but whether with full honors or not is unlikely, because Yongle also, when he sent him back, and this is the visit in which the stele was taken. So, no, I'm sorry, it's the subsequent visit of Zheng He. When he sends him back, he also sends him back an order of investiture that one of his kinsmen should take over as king. So it's not full honors. He's been dethroned, and a substitute has been put in his place. And in fact, it's quite a successful substitute. This guy continues, I shouldn't call him this guy, excuse me. Prakrama Bahu VI is his formal title. Lives till 1462, and he regularly sends tribute missions back to China. He's learned the lesson that was being taught, if you like. We have, okay, so that's the Chinese version. We have a Portuguese, no, excuse me, first of all, a Sinhalese source for this, which says, and I'm going to quote this is from the Raja Valya, the historical narrative of kings. Quote, during the reign of King Vijayabahu, Dos Raja, which is how they refer to it, Zhenghe, they're calling him a Raja. Zhenghe has become a king in the Sinhalese context. Dos Raja, king of Great China, landed in Lanka with an immense army. And under pretext of bringing presents and curiosities, craftily carried away King Vijayabahu, who fell into his hands, foolishly thinking that he also brought presents as other princes had done. Vijayabahu's 4 younger brothers were killed. Taking many captives, Dos Raja, Zhenghe, returned to Great China. Now, the text is interesting for many reasons. It's always Great China. It's not China. It's Great China. There is an understanding here of what the great state thinking is. And also, all 4 of his younger brothers were killed in this battle. So it was not a swift, decisive intervention that they slipped in and captured the king. It was a bloody battle in which important people on both sides were killed. It was a very violent confrontation. Now, a 17th century Portuguese historian picks up this story from other Sinhalese sources, and he puts it this way, that when Vijayabahu was king, they're put in an armada of the Chins. This is from Diogo de Conto. Those of the country not being afraid of him, the day that they intended to embark, that is the day Zhenghe was about to leave, he captured the king and sacked his city. And carrying off from it great treasure, they departed for China and presented the captive king to their king. Now, de Conto is not a pro-Chinese source. He calls the Chinese wicked people. And certainly that is the local cultural memory among Sri Lankans, that the Chinese conducted themselves inappropriately. So, as I said, the new king, Prakrama Bahu, was put in place by the Yongle emperor, and he plays the game. The last Sri Lankan envoy to go to China went in 1459. This is, 25 years after the last time Zhenghe visited the island. But the Sri Lankans kept this up in order to maintain peaceful relationships and not to be interfered with again. Well, the man behind all of this is Yongle. He had an unwavering vision that the Ming was not simply going to pull inside its borders and be another Chinese dynasty. He was ambitious. He was ambitious to recapture all of the territory controlled by Kublai Khan. But he was even more ambitious. Kublai had sent messengers out into the maritime world, but he was even more ambitious. And this is why Zhenghe is traveling into the Indian Ocean. We get a glimpse of his vision in a proclamation he issues in the summer of 1403. He says, in less than 10 years, he's referring here now to his father, in less than 10 years, as heroes arose and joined forces, my father settled the land within the passes, cleared the Great Plain, conquered the Yuan capital, thereby merging into one all territory within the seas. So he describes his father taking the entirety of the Yuan great state. In fact, it's not true, but that's all right. It's something he had to claim. But this idea of unifying the continent into one thing, it's an expression that is not used really before the Yuan dynasty. This idea that the region that the state controls should be one thing. This idea of unification is a powerful one for the Mongols and becomes a powerful one also for the early Ming. But Yongle needed evidence that he, in fact, did rule everything. And so he started out immediately. As soon as he was on the throne, he starts sending envoys out to the first group of envoys goes in September 1602, sent by the Ministry of Rights. The order goes out in September 1602. They leave on the 3rd of October to Japan, to Okinawa, to Vietnam, to Champa, South Vietnam, to Siam, Java, Samudra, the north end of Sumatra, and then vaguely Xi'an, which can mean the Coromandel coast. It can mean, sometimes means Sri Lanka. It sometimes just means the Indian subcontinent. So envoys are dispatched to announce Yonglö's succession. Now, Yonglö had another problem, which is that he murdered his nephew to get to the throne and had no legitimacy within China. So he's partly hoping that the tail will wag the dog on this one. And that's the explanation I usually use when I think of Emperor Yonglö. But I want to think more expansively about his idea that he's a ruler of a great state. The following summer, 25th of August, 1403, another set of envoys is sent out to the same countries, and he adds a few more. One's sent to Thailand. There's another state that is sent. Okay. So Yonglö is seeking to announce his presence to the world. 2 months before sending that second group of ambassadors, there's a one-line reference in the veritable records, which is a summary of the court diary that is produced at the end of every reign. One line. It's in the June of 1403, and it goes like this. The Fujian Regional Military Commission is ordered to build 137 ocean-going vessels. This is the first reference, and one of very few references in the court diary, to the idea of building enormous fleets and sailing them into the Indian Ocean. It's a precious record because we really have almost nothing in the early years in which this new endeavor to assert great state presence in the Indian Ocean is being planned. 3 months later, the next thing I found, 3 months later in the same source, there's an order that looks like purely a personnel matter. It's for the creation of a set of institutions to manage maritime traffic. A quote, His Majesty notes that the goods that foreign envoys, traveling by ship from maritime states to present tribute, bring to exchange. These goods should be handled by officials appointed for the purpose. And then he instructs the Ministry of Personnel, quote, to follow the regulations of my father's era and set up maritime trade commissions in Zhejiang, Fujian, and Guangdong under the supervision of their provincial administrative commissioners, effectively their governors. This is not what his father ordered, but that doesn't matter. You have to say so. So an administration is being put in place to handle the traffic that is going to be created by sending these fleets abroad. So that's the beginning of the move southwards. But I found another shipbuilding order 10 days after the first one to the southeast coast. This is a shipbuilding order that goes out to 5 military commissions along the Yangtze River, including Nanjing. And it's an order for 200 ocean-going vessels. But these are earmarked not to sail to the south, they're to sail north through what is called the Maritime Rice Transport System. This is a system by which South China is a greater producer of grain than north, and grain has to be shipped north in order to support the north. And so this is the sign that Yonglö has decided to revive this system of shipping grain. It means he's not going to rebuild the Grand Canal, which is the standard way that you send grain barges north. He wants ocean-going vessels, and they're going to carry the grain north. In fact, within a decade, he's given up on the maritime grain shipment process, and he decides to rebuild the Grand Canal. But what it signals to me is that in the late spring, summer of 1403, he's getting things in motion. He wants grain capacity to move grain to the north set up, not to support Beijing, although he will eventually move the capital to Beijing, but to support the armies in North China with which he is going to invade the Mongols. So he's got 137 ships being built to sail south, 200 ships being built to sail north. This boat building, the northern boat building, is traditionally viewed as a stopgap measure before the Grand Canal is rebuilt. And I see it part of a much larger plan. Now, what is curious is that the veritable record, which, as I said, is based from the court diary, it's what went on in the presence of the emperor in the capital. The veritable record is not entirely silent on the Zheng He expeditions and not entirely silent on the campaigns against the Mongols, on one of which, by the way, Yongle will die. He personally leads the armies into Mongolia, as a good Mongol Khan should. But that near silence makes me think of the, not near silence, but absolute silence about Marco Polo in the records, in Chinese records. No Chinese record mentions that Marco Polo was there. This is a useful parallel, I think. Kublai Khan had what were called the Sumu, the people of the various categories. These were anyone who wasn't Mongol and Chinese, so Khitans, Jurchens, Venetians, Persians, Arabs, whoever were there to serve his realm. They operated a separate bureaucracy. And the Chinese records rarely register these people because these people they were overseeing some of what was going on in China, but they were a separate bureaucracy that worked directly for the Great Khan and of no interest to Chinese historiographers, and really not the business of Chinese historiographers to talk about. Well, in some way, I wonder if this isn't the same thing going on. That is, Zheng He, I think he probably appears about 10 times in the veritable records. For somebody who led 7 voyages over a period of 30 years involving tens of thousands of people and vast expensive resources, it's argued that South China basically loses its forest cover as a result of the shipbuilding exercise. That he shouldn't much appear in the records is probably parallel to that. And so we have to think, okay, well, who was Zheng He? And in some ways, he fits this Sumu category very nicely. He was a Muslim. He was captured and enslaved at the age of 10 in 1381 during the first Ming Emperor's campaigns into Yunnan to extend his state down into the southwest. Allegedly, Zheng He's great-great-great-grandfather was a Khwarezmian Muslim with a Persian name whose family surrendered to Genghis Khan in Bukhara. I can't do the dates offhand, but probably over a century earlier. So this great-great-great-grandfather served Kublai Khan in his early career as one of his Sumu officials, notably as his financial comptroller. So as happened with most Muslims in China, his Persian name is eventually lost or transmutes into the standard Chinese Muslim surname of Ma. All Chinese Muslims almost become Ma. And so this is the name with which Zheng He was born. He was actually born Ma He in a Muslim family. So Yunnan in that period was still under Mongol rule. There was so Zheng He's father died in the resistance against the Chinese invasion, the takeover of the small Muslim state, Mongol ruler, but also Muslim, Mongol Muslim ruler. And so Zheng He's father dies in that resistance. When he was captured, Zheng was 10 years old. And as often happens to a boy captured that age, he is castrated and sent to work as a slave in one of the princely households. Castration was a punishment for those who resisted, but it also meant that it created a stock of personnel to go to work in the harems, either of the emperor or of the princes. The prince he was sent to serve was the man who becomes, we'll leave it here, was the man who becomes Emperor Yongle. As a teenager, apparently, he became a soldier and fought with Yongle in his armies against the Mongols when he was still a prince. He gained his master's trust, and so when his master becomes the emperor, Zheng He becomes the eunuch slave to whom he turns to carry out his diplomatic initiative into the Indian Ocean. Quite what I'm calling him Ma, what Zheng's personal religious position becomes is very difficult to read. He offers sacrifices to the Buddha. He offers sacrifices to the Empress of Heaven, who's a maritime cult figure in the southeast. He is a Muslim. He sends he doesn't himself go to Mecca, but he sends some of his associates to Mecca. He seems to live in this multi-confessional, multicultural, multilingual world. And it's very hard to pin him down as a Chinese admiral, which is how he is usually depicted. Well, concluding remarks. The founder, Zhu Yuanzhang, founded the Ming roughly on the model of the Yuan Great State, but it was Yongle, his son, who, seizing the throne from his nephew, really turns the Ming back into a great state. The Ming becomes, to use the European term, becomes an empire. It wouldn't last long. His grandson, Emperor Xuande, as you can see from this painting, is very much in the martial Mongol Great Khan tradition. But by the time his grandson Zhengtong is on the throne, this is lost. Zhengtong, as a teenager, leads a vast army against the Mongols. In 1449, he's captured, he's taken hostage. It's a massive failure, and at that point, the Ming gives up being a great state. It still calls itself the Da Ming, but it really retracts and becomes another Chinese dynasty, waiting unwittingly for the arrival of the next great state, the Qing dynasty, in 1644. And as I said in my first lecture, we all now stand downstream from this history. Thank you.